Hello, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for Sean from organising this and sponsoring, and thanks to Claudio. It was a really good talk. I enjoyed that. So, welcome to my talk, Write You a Static Site Generator with Node.js. Today I'm going to be talking about static site generators. I'm going to be talking about the decisions that go into building them. I'm going to be talking about the structure and code of a static site generator. And then I'm going to end with a brief talk about the Jam stack and some of the tools and some best practices for when you're going to use that in production. So before I go on, who has heard of the Jam stack?
I cheated because I read the meetup.
And has anyone used or is using static site generators like Jekyll? Okay, so good for that. So just before I get into any of this, I'm going to be using async and await for a lot of this. So if you don't know what that is, just think about it as if it's asynchronous. So first of all, my name's Adam. I'm a transition year student at Skerries Community College, that's second level. I've been using Node for about 2 years now. My Twitter's up there at AdamIsn'tDead. And if you want any of the slides or the source code for the talk, it's you can just go to tinyurl.com/node-static. So if anyone has any questions during this, just leave it till the end and I'll be able to answer them. Unless it's about the font size or anything that I can just fix now. So I want to start out with what a static site generator actually is. So a static site generator is just a program which takes in some sort of input and outputs a static site. So that's going to be plain like HTML, CSS, and front-end JavaScript. It's the sort of site that you don't need any sort of back-end language to run. You could just run it on something like an Apache server or something. It's the sort of site you could host on one of those sort of shared hosting packages or on GitHub Pages or Surge.sh or something. So if you want a comparison, think of it as instead of baking a new pie for each person that comes in, you're just baking a pie at the start and then you're just handing out them to each person that needs it. So there's many different kinds of static site generator, and they're really going to depend on what they're used for. There's going to be some for blogs, some for portfolios, some for news sites, some for shops. And there's also the data that you're going to be giving into the static site generators is going to also be really dependent on the type that it is. So why would you use a static site generator over using just a normal monolithic Node app or something? So the first reason is simplicity. So once you do run your static site generator and you get a website, and you put that online, it's online. So you don't need to manage things like keeping your WordPress installation up to date. You don't need to make sure your database is online and maintain that. So think about it if I want to just publish a blog post, I don't want to have to come back every 2 weeks and update my WordPress version so I don't get hacked. So really related to that is security. So we're probably all aware that CMSs like WordPress do have vulnerabilities, and most of these don't come from the fact that they're actually bad pieces of code. In fact, they're usually really well written. It's just that there's so many different parts. So I might go, ooh, I want to add this social plugin, so I'm just going to click that and add that, and then that's another vector where my site could then be attacked. So because we're using static site, it means that we don't have any live database that can just be changed. We don't have any configuration files that people can try access, so we don't have to think about things like SQL injection. Also, if we need extra features that would normally require a backend, we can do them in ways that sort of reduce the risks. So using things like microservices or using external third-party APIs. We can also do things like version control, so if something does go wrong with your site, you can just roll back to the previous version and you can sort of see all the changes. The next reason is performance. So because we don't have any sort of processing time on the server, we just have the time from you to the static file server and then back. It means that it's going to be much quicker than having to process each request and then building out templates each time and stuff like that. It also means that we can cache files really easily, so if something's not going to change that often, or just if we want to use stuff online, we can do that really easily using things like service workers. And we can also put everything on a CDN, so instead of me in Ireland having to connect to a server in Australia, I can just connect to a smaller one that's somewhere in Europe, so it can be much quicker and much quicker request times. Also, load balancing becomes really, really trivial. Because there's no sort of sessions or big monolithic app which we have to look after, it's really quick to horizontally scale, so we can just scale out that web server. Lastly is flexibility. So because it's very loosely coupled between sort of the back-end services and their actual like content and site, it means that it's going to be a lot easier to develop, it's going to be a lot easier to debug, and it's also going to be really easy to find and make it fit your team's workflow or your own workflow. And if you can't find a tool that does work, you can just build it using something from the ecosystem, and it's not too hard, as I will show you. So you can't really talk about static sites without mentioning a few popular ones. The first is Jekyll. It was sort of the the first mainstream static site generator. I think it was developed in about 2008, and it was actually developed by the co-founder of GitHub, Tom Preston-Werner, who actually wrote that Semver document that Claudio was talking about. But it's written in Ruby, and it uses liquid templates. There's a really big ecosystem around Jekyll, partly because GitHub Pages supports it natively, so you can just add things like plugins as gems, which are like the equivalent of Node packages for the equivalent of Node packages for Ruby, and it is really popular. But there is one downside, which is that it can be very slow, because Ruby is quite a slow language, and I had a site that used Jekyll and it had something like an 8-second page build time, which just wasn't really that usable. So as an alternative to this was sort of Hugo, which is really similar in sort of the source structure to Jekyll, but it's written in Go, which is a compiled language, and that's one of the reasons why it's really, really fast. But it's not as flexible as something like Jekyll because you can't add plugins because it's compiled. But this does mean there's less configuration, it's easier to get up and running, and again, there's going to be a really big community around Hugo as well. That is just two. There is many others. I have on screen here a website called Static Gen. This is literally like a website that just lists out static site generators, and I think there's something like 350 different ones listed on the website. So you can probably find something that fits your needs if you want to. There's three sort of notable ones you should look at if you're considering it. There's Hexo, which is a blogging engine written in Node.js. There's Wintersmith, which is just basically like a core that you add on the different components that you need. And then there's also ones for like front-end frameworks like Gatsby, which would use React, or VuePress, which was something like fairly recent for Vue. So on to actually writing a static site generator. So first of all, why would you write your own static site generator compared to just picking one up off the shelf and using it? Firstly is that you get to choose your own stack. So if I want to use, and I know a certain set of tools, like let's say I really like using Pug, which used to be Jade, and I really like to write using Markdown, and I can't find something that works for me, then it might be the best option to write my own. Next is speed. So because you're writing it yourself, you don't need to add features that you won't need. You can reduce the amount of bloat in the software and you can make it quicker. And if there is issues with your performance, you can also go into the code yourself and you can go and change stuff, and you don't need to wait for something upstream to change as well. With this, you'll also have an in-depth knowledge of the internals, and with this, it'll be easier to debug and solve problems. So when you're actually going to write a site with your static site generator and something's going wrong, you're probably going to have a much easier time fixing it than having to wait for like upstream changes or like try to understand their code base and figure out whether the error lies in your stuff or their stuff. And also with this is you can also reduce reliance on an external or upstream project. So this wouldn't matter so much if you're using something like Jekyll, but if you decide that you want to use this particular set of tools and it only finds like a project that hasn't been updated in like 2 years, it might not be the best idea to go and pick up all your websites and move it to this different project that's not maintained. So that might be another reason why you would write your own. So why would you choose Node.js? So there's a few reasons for this as well, why you would choose Node over some other language. The first and probably the most important one would be the ecosystem. So as you're probably all aware, there's like a Node packages for pretty much anything you're going to need to do. So it's going to be really quick to get something up and running and make something work that you need it to. Next reason is that it's fast. So it's going to be a bit faster than using something like Ruby. It's well supported. There's already a lot of like quick libraries written for everything. Also, asynchronous programming, which is really, really core to Node, can actually make your generators faster. So think of it, instead of reading a file and then waiting for it to build and then outputting from the file system, I could do like start loading all of my files and then wait for all of them to be done at the same time in parallel, and then I can process them in parallel and then I can output them in parallel. So that's going to be a lot quicker than doing one at a time. And next is isomorphism, also known as JavaScript is everywhere. So if I have some sort of like code which is on the client and I decide I want to put that into my static site generator, I can just copy and paste that code in and I won't need to do any changes. And it also means I don't have to keep context switching between some sort of back-end language and some sort of front-end language. So when you're actually going to write your generator, there's going to be two big questions which you're going to have to be thinking about. The first is, what does your content look like? So you actually have to feed something into your static site generator, otherwise it would be fairly pointless because it wouldn't be doing anything. So you're going to have to be thinking about how you're actually going to feed the data in. So the data can be coming in any forms. It could be a text file, it could be Markdown, it could be a Google Sheets document somewhere, it could be coming off a database, it could be coming from an API. There's going to be a lot of options here. But there are two main ones that you should probably be considering, YAML and Markdown. So you're probably all aware that Markdown is a text-based format you can use. It's primarily used for writing. You can do things like headings, images, bolds, links, stuff like that. It's very flexible and it's also very tangible, so like if you go into the source file you can actually go and read it. Next is YAML. So YAML is just key value pairs. It's quite similar in structure to JSON, and it's really easy to parse into JSON, and you can express all kinds of like data and metadata, and you can do nested stuff as well, and it's quite readable as well, so that's why it's a good choice for specifying data. So maybe you do care about how your data is stored, maybe you don't, but you're also going to have to think about how you're going to edit your content. So like I know personally that I have no problem going into like my code editor and editing a Markdown file, but let's say you want to work with someone and who's going to be writing posts and they don't like working like this and they like using certain editors, you might be thinking about how you're going to edit your content. So there's a lot of options here. I'll be talking about this towards the end of the talk, but it can be involving things like a API first CMS where you just get all your data from the API, or it could just be like setting up just like an interface for editing. So that's going to be really linked. So if I decide I want to use a certain service for like editing my content, that might be where I get my data from. So they're going to be two very related things. Next is going to be a few smaller choices. This is just going to be tools you can pick. So first of all, you're going to have to think about your configuration. So you're going to have to tell the static site generator certain things about your site, like where you're going to output all the files to, or where you're going to copy stuff from, or maybe the name of the site and things like this. So there's two big options here. The first one's just keeping it in JSON. So this is fairly simple. It's probably the easiest option for Node. So that's just putting it all into a file like config.json and doing it like that. And then you can also use something like YAML, as I discussed already. There's a library I've got on screen here called JS YAML, which is a really, like, it's the library I use for doing stuff with YAML, and it's pretty easy to use and it's already pretty quick. So next you have to be thinking about your content and layouts. So I already spoke a little bit about the content. So if you want to use Markdown, there's probably like 10 different widely used, well-supported libraries for Markdown. So the one I use is Markdown.js, just because it has a really, really simple API, but there's probably a lot more as well. But also you have to be thinking about your layouts. So what this means is like, okay, I have my content here, but then how's the actual HTML all around that going to look? And that's how you're going to specify it with layouts. So there's a load of different options here as well. My favorite is Handlebars, and it's what I use throughout this talk. And it's just, you just put in certain bits into your HTML. It's kind of like template literals in JavaScript. You're just saying, okay, this is my HTML, this is my HTML, here's the heading tag, and inside this I want to slot in the name of the site and the content. There's also other options like Pug, which used to be called Jade, which won't be the same, like it's going to use like a completely different format to HTML, but it will compile down as well. So there's loads of options here, like there's EJS, there's like .t, you can use like liquid templates as well. So by no means is this exhaustive, so you're going to have to look and see what works best for you or whoever you're going to be building your site with. There's also a few generic tools which will come in very handy if you're writing one. First is FS Extra. So if you haven't heard of FS Extra, it is a module for dealing with the file system. What it mainly does is it wraps all of the file system methods in promises, which has actually just been done in the Node.js version 10. But anyway, so there's promisified versions of all the APIs and callbacks as well if you want. But there's also a load of extra methods which come in really handy for doing things like removing a whole folder or making a directory in a certain path without doing it step by step. Next one is a globbing library. So this is going to be the same as if you're on your command line and you type like ls ***/ and then you list out all the files in all the directories. So it just allows you to get all the files that match a certain pattern that you give. And lastly is grey matter. So if you do decide to go with something like Markdown or just using plain HTML, you might want to specify extra data, things like what I want the permalink to be for the page, or like things like that. So you'll do that through front matter. So this is just putting a little piece of like JSON or YAML into like the top of the file, and then it will read this. So grey matter is a library for doing this really easily. It's really fast, it's really extensible, so you can use whatever you want. And that's probably the best option for using front matter in your sites. So as regards the actual static site generator, there is 4 main parts or sort of stages as part of it. And this is going to be really similar for most static site generators. I looked through the Jekyll code base, and this is almost identical to how they do it, with just a few extra stages for their individual sort of way they work. First is cleaning. So this is going to be, because we're outputting static files, we're actually going to have to output them somewhere. So in this stage, we would be going through and deleting all of the old files that we don't need anymore. And if we had any local state for our generator, we'd be clearing it here as well. Then we have reading. So this is going to be getting all of our content. So if I have it on the file system, I'd be reading it there. If it was on some sort of API, I might get the data from the API or database or whatever. So once we have our files read like that, we're going to be rendering them. So that's going to be taking our content and putting them through maybe our templating engine, maybe our Markdown parser, and then getting our raw HTML. So once we have our HTML, then we would be outputting that to the file system. So then we can actually look at our static site generator. So now onto the code. So there's a few things I just sort of chose to use in the code for this. I decided to use an ES6 class for representing the generator, and it's probably not the best option for like all situations, but I wanted to get something up and running fairly quickly, and it does make it a bit easier to manage state. But if you want something to be a little bit more pluggable, it might be easier to use just individual like functions that go into each other. So I decided to make a few choices for this. I didn't want to use any sort of assets or any sort of like post-production pipeline like minifying anything, and I also didn't include any plugins just to make it a little bit simpler. But I did decide to use JSON for the configuration, Markdown for the content, YAML for the front matter, and then Handlebars for my layouts. So onto the actual code. So the configuration, as I said, is going to be using JSON. So I want to specify the site's configuration in some sort of format, something like this. So I'm just giving a couple of things like the title, the description, maybe the author, and then a few settings for the actual generator, like a static folder that I'm just going to copy and paste into the output, and then where I'm actually going to output the files to. So this is going to be really easy to get. There is a really lovely method in FS Extra called getJSON, which basically just does an fs.read file and then does json.parse on that. So it's just another method that's really handy to use. So we're just waiting for that to be done and then returning it as promised. So once we have our configuration, we can actually get onto the main generator. So as I said, we're going to be using an ES6 class. In the constructor, I'm taking the configuration, and then I'm saving that in like a local variable, and then I have a place to store all the pages, and then all the things that I'm going to be outputting to the file system. So I wanted this to all be based around one sort of central build method, so I just call something.build, and then my whole site would be generated. So the way that would work would be I'd be getting my configuration, I'd be then taking that configuration and creating a new site generator with that configuration, and then I'd be calling build. I'm catching all the errors for everything here. This is probably not the best, but just declutters all of my code for the purpose of this. You probably want to be watching for errors at all the different stages and catching them as they happen, but that's just what I did. So, as I said, there was 4 main stages, so they're going to be going into the build process. We can see that we've got the the reset stage, the cleaning stage, the reading stage, the rendering, and the write, and they're just going to be methods on our class. So as you can see, they're just there. So this is where we're going to be scaffolding out the code for the generator. So first up is the reset method. So this is just going to be deleting the old code and creating a new directory. So there's a really handy method in FS Extra just called remove, which basically just does like a rimwrap on that directory. It saves you importing another module, and then we're going to create a new empty directory in the path given. As you can see there, I'm using the public directory specified in the configuration, but I could obviously, if I wanted to be more opinionated, I could just hardcode that in if I wanted. So next up is the reading. So I'm going to apologize that this is so big. I couldn't make it any smaller, but I will be going through it anyway. So first of all, I'm going to be using these modules. If you can't read that, really sorry, but we're using the grey matter module I mentioned. We're using a slug module, which just slugifies file names, and then the globbing library fastglob. So first of all, I'm going to be reading all the files in the content directory, and then that's going to be stored in a big files variable. And once I have them, I'm going to be looping over all the different files. I'm going to read them, and then I'm going to put them into the front matter engine and grab all the front matter and then the content as well. And then at the bottom there, I'm going to be just adding that to the pages object so that it can be outputted and rendered. So 3 main parts: reading all the content, reading all the content, and then reading the individual files, getting the front matter, and then adding them to that page. So once we have them, we can then render them. So this is again big file, really sorry. But so first of all, everything here is going to be going through a templating engine, and I wanted to pass in some details about the site. So I'm just creating a variable here which has all the pages and the configuration, so I can access them from the templates. So first I'm going to loop through all of the pages that I just got from the reading stage, and then I'm going to render the initial content with the templating engine. And then after I've got that, if I want to use the Markdown, which will be set from the front matter, then I'll be rendering that using Markdown. And then if the layout is set, I'm going to read that layout, I'm going to compile it, and then pass in that data. So that just returns HTML, and then we have everything stored in our content. And then we're going to be adding that page, the rendered page, to this output array, which is just going to be a path and some content. So once we have all these files rendered, we can then write the output to the file system. So there is a great method on FXextra called output file, which is just creating a new file and then sending the content into it. It saves you having to create the sort of directories. So if I want to do like having index.html files in a directory, so I don't have to just go something.html, it means I don't have to go and create the folders myself. So here I'm not actually awaiting everything, they're all individual promises, and at the end I'm then resolving all of them. So that's where the sort of asynchronous sort of thing will come in, so we can do things at the same time. And that is it. That is all the code for a simple static site generator. So I have here, like this is a site, it's really simple, but it uses all the same code that was just on screen. And as I said at the start of the talk, all the source code is on GitHub. I gave the link there, I'll give it again at the end of the talk. But I would really encourage you, if you do or didn't really get that, just go and look. It's fairly easy to understand. But so you can see this is just a normal site here, and then we can have things like our markdown and stuff. So it does work. So there's a few things you can do if you want to keep going with your static site generator. The first one's like an assets pipeline. So maybe you want to use something like Sass or CSS Next, or maybe you want to use Babel for your front-end CSS. You could add that sort of thing into your static site generator. You can also make it into a CLI, so if you want to just type like the name of it and then like build or something, you can do that as well. You can also like watch for changes and do incremental builds, so if I only change one little file, I could just go then and compile that one thing rather than doing everything all again. Or I could add in plugins. So if you're thinking about adding in plugins, there's a few things you'll have to consider, like what sort of plugins you want to add and then how you're actually going to do it. Like those are going to be dependency injection or like full-on plugin systems. So, onto the actual Jamstack. So, as some of you are probably not aware, the Jamstack is not really a stack in the same way that the mean stack or the lamp stack would be. It's more just a methodology or like a way of building sites. So here we're not talking about specific operating systems or databases or specific web servers or languages. We're just talking about a way of building things. And it's about a way of building things that are quicker, they're higher security, higher performance, have a lower cost of scaling, and have a better sort of developer experience. So the Jamstack, the first Jam is an acronym. First is J, which stands for JavaScript. So that's going to be front-end JavaScript. So all dynamic content on your site is going to be gotten through JavaScript. So it's not going to be served each time from a back-end. So this can be just vanilla JavaScript. It could be adding something like a front-end library like React or a framework like that. And next is APIs, which is the A. So this is going to be all that content dynamic content that you do need, you're going to be getting through APIs. So instead of having to do something on the server each time, we're going to be fetching from sort of reusable APIs or microservices or like third-party libraries and stuff like that. And lastly is M, which stands for markup. So this is going to be what you actually build from your static site generator and that you're actually going to be serving. So those three parts make up all the parts of the Jamstack. So there's not going to be any sort of underlying layer other than that. It's just JavaScript, front-end JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So the Jamstack was like a term that was coined by Netlify. Netlify is a company that does all this sort of stuff. They do a lot of open source work with the Jamstack, and you'll see their name come up time and time again. They had a whole conference just called the Jamstack Conference, and they do a lot of work to do with this. And if you are considering doing a site with this sort of architecture, they have some great hosting plans. It's free, and it's what I use to host all of my sites. So where the Jamstack really comes into a powerful way of doing things is with its best practices. So the first one is everything on a CDN. So as I said before, because we just have static files, it makes it really easy to put things on a CDN. So when I'm an end user, instead of connecting to a server halfway across the world, I can just connect to one that's quite close. And because we're just using static files, it's really easy to put them on a CDN. Next is atomic deploys. So this goes back into the developer experience part. So instead of waiting every 2 weeks and doing one massive deploy, I'm going to be doing small changes and deploying them, which will also encourage you to do things like making it really easy to build and sort of taking away the dread that comes with actually doing deploys. Next is instant cache invalidation. So when I do change something, I don't want any users to have any old content, so I want to have an easy way to invalidate all of the caches that are held by all of the end users so they're not having old content. Next is version control everything. So again, because we're just using static content, it's going to be really easy to put everything on something like Git or Subversion or whatever you want to use. So version controlling everything means again that the developer experience is going to be better. And then the last one is automated builds. So instead of having to go, okay, I'm going to build all the static content, and then I'm going to compile all my CSS, and then I'm going to minify everything, and then I'm going to push it. I want to be able to do everything in one step. So this is going to be, again, a much easier experience for the developers. So where does Node.js come into all of this? So Node is going to be quite a powerful tool for using with this. As I said, there's no sort of back-end server to all of this apart from your APIs, but that's where Node does come in. So Node is really well supported by things like AWS, Lambda, or any other sort of functions as a service. So it's going to be really easy to get going and prototyping. The whole ecosystem is going to make it really easy to get stuff started and find modules that you need. And also you can use it for writing things like static site generators or other tools like that. Also, because we're using Node, it means we can use the same language on the client as on our sort of backends, so we can eliminate any sort of context switching. So there are a few tools that if you do decide to go and use the Jamstack that you'll probably end up looking at. So because we don't have any sort of back-end server per se, you're going to have to think about ways of doing things slightly differently than you would normally. So if I want to do an e-commerce site, I'm going to have to, instead of doing everything just on a back-end server, I'm going to have to think about how I'm going to manage this. So the first couple of options are something like Gumroad. So this is going to be, I put all my products there, I'm given a little tag that I put in, a buy button, and then when I buy that, they do it through the Gumroad service. The same sort of thing for Shopify, they have an option called the buy button. You're just adding a little button to your site. You can also use something like Stripe, and you could add that with a serverless function or something like that sort of architecture. And then of course Netlify has an option which is a little API-based service which handles orders, payments. It integrates with Stripe, pricing and stuff like that. And if you need forms, there's also a few options for this. My favorite is FormSpree. This is what I use for all of my websites. It's just you just add it to your normal forms. It's just you change the action to the FormSpree website, and then it'll forward all the data onto you. And then there's also other options like Typeform, which is going to be a big sort of complete change to just having forms on your websites. And then Netlify has an option too, which is similar to FormSpree, but it's a little bit more flexible and integrates with your Netlify account. If you do need to have something like search on your site, there's a few options. There's something like Algolia, which, as Claudio said, is what Yarn uses. It's got a good free package, but you have to display their little logo on it. But it is really powerful and it's really good. You can also use something like Google Custom Search, which used to be much popular a few years back, but sort of died a little bit. So that is another option as well. And you can also do front-end JavaScript search. That was my favorite option, Lunar.js, which I used for one project like 6 months ago or something. If you need to add login to your sites, there's a few options for that as well. The big one is just Auth0, so that's going to be back-endless login. It's really, really popular. It's used for a lot of single-page apps and a lot of mobile sites, or not mobile sites, a lot of mobile apps. And it's based around OAuth. It's got a great free plan, very flexible. And then Netlify has an option too. I wouldn't really recommend it because it only supports, I think, Google and GitHub and maybe one other. But it is really integrated, but it's not that flexible. And there's also like comments. There's a few options here, like using something like dismiss comments. This is like the standard for pretty much like all static sites. And it's probably the best option for it, but it can have some slow loading times. Then you could just do something like adding Facebook comments to it, which is going to be really, really easy to integrate, but it won't be as flexible. So, on the CMS, so I mentioned before that you're going to have to be thinking about how you're actually going to edit your content. So, there is a load of different options for CMSs as well. One of the big ones is Contentful. It's sort of a REST API-based CMS. It's mobile friendly, it's fast. There's only one downside, and that's really, really, really expensive. So there's a free plan that you have like 10 content types and like one user, but it goes up to like $150 a month just for like a few extra things. So the next one is Prismic, which is really similar, but it is a lot cheaper. It's used by a couple of big clients, again, sort of a REST API-based thing. Something like Storyblock is completely different. You build everything using little blocks, has like live editing. This is what I use a lot. This is what I use for all my websites to have this sort of architecture. And it's got a great free plan, but you do have to pay to have version control. You can also use something like Dropbox. There's an article I have here just called Creating Websites with Dropbox Powered Hosting Tools. So there's a great Dropbox API, and if that's how your team wants to work, there's loads of different options you can do like that. Also, of course, Netlify has an option, which is just sort of you just throw the file into your like the static content of your site, and then you just log in. You can change stuff to do with Git. Again, like static site generators, there is a load of different options for this as well. There's a whole website dedicated to it. There is like probably, I think there's like 50 different options last time I checked. So there's going to be a lot of flexibility around this as well. So lastly, when would I not use the Jamstack? So it's not an architecture that works for every project. It's going to usually depend on what other people like around your project want to use. So when it's just a project you're doing on your own individually, you can still use whatever you want. But like if you're building a site for someone else, the cost can be a bit prohibitive. It's going to be a lot easier to just go and do a one-click WordPress installation than it is to go and scaffold out a whole static site with like Jekyll or something. There's going to be possibly a little bit more of a learning curve if you haven't used this sort of thing before. So it's probably not the best option if you want to get something up and running like right now. And also it just doesn't suit some people's like organization. So if I work with a big team of like media editors and they all like to work in this specific format, it just might not be the best option compared with some pre-existing tools. Also, sometimes it can just be the technical requirements. Like if you're building like a company intranet, like it's not really going to matter the sort of like scaling abilities. Like it might just be quicker just to write a big monolithic app. So that's it. If you want to get any of the code that I put up on screen, you can get it there, tinyurl.com/node-static. If you want to follow me on Twitter, again, it's @AmazonDead, and that's the same for my GitHub. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.